Welcome you all for session 3 of day 4. Uh, the speaker for this session, Professor Ellen, has already joined us. And Professor Ellen is a professor of law at the Warwick Law School. He's a legal theorist and criminal lawyer with interest in socio-legal and dialectical theory and critical realism. He held the Edmund Davies Chair of Criminal Law and Criminal Justice at King's College London, and the Draper's Chair in Law at Queen Mary and Westfield College. Professor has published 3 editions of book titled as Crime, Reason and History, and also another book titled as Justice and the Slaughter Bench, which is a collection of essays on law's broken dialect. He recently completed a 3-year project on the topic of criminal justice, the blaming relation, which explore issues of guilt and forgiveness in and beyond law. Professor Allen is going to talk about the topic on criminal justice and moral psychology.
Yes,
Professor
Amit.
Yes.
Before he start, let me welcome Professor Ellen on behalf of this university. Thank you, Ellen, so much. Thank you. After seeing you long time. Thank you so much for joining. It's such a wonderful, occasion to meet you virtually on this platform for your talk today to this university. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, shall I start then? And
yes.
Well, Professor Bajpai, Professor Pandey, all other participants, it's lovely to see you. It's one of the, if there can be any positives coming out of the last couple of years in COVID, it is our capacity to talk to each other across distances electronically, and I suspect this wouldn't have happened before COVID. But it's a minor compensation for everything that we've gone through in the last couple of years. My topic today is moral psychology and criminal justice, and I have some slides which I hope I can share with you. Let me see if I can.
Share. There is a button called share.
Yeah.
Button number 3 on your screen.
Is that working for you?
Yes, it's working, I think.
Okay, right. Thanks. Okay, so
yes.
Yeah, so we're good to go then. So again, thank you very much for having me. Here's the basic outline for my talk, some general points, and then I'm going to raise the question generally, what is moral psychology? And then, having done that, I'm going to think about how moral psychology relates to criminal justice. And there are I want to focus on 2 different possibilities. One is the concept of a mature moral psychology, which establishes a moral grammar for thinking about criminal justice. And alongside that, secondly, existing criminal justice ethics, which can be seen as ethically primitive in comparison to the mature forms that one finds in moral psychology. And I want to end by talking about the complexity of the arrangement of these 2 kinds of moral psychology in relation to criminal justice, and to say a little bit about how they relate to abolition. This is when Amit introduced me, he said that I had been working on a long-term project, and I'm still working on that long-term project. That's why it's called a long-term project, but I am actually quite close to finishing it. I'm working on the book and hoping to finish it this year. Nonetheless, I'm still working through these ideas, and it's helpful for me to share them with you. I hope it's useful for you to hear what I have to say. So some general points then. First, I begin with a quote from a novel, actually, Richard Powers' The Overstory, which I recently read, and it's a novel about trees. and about eco-activism. And it's based on in a kind of deep ecology. And here's a quote from the novel. "The single best thing you can do for the world. It occurs to her the problem begins with that word world. It means two such opposite things. The real one we cannot see, the invented one we can't escape. The real one we cannot see, the invented one we cannot escape." For those of you who maybe know my work, I've been strongly influenced by the philosophy of Roy Bhaskar, and he has a theory of modernity which he describes as involving a demi-reality, and that is very much this idea that we live in a world that is our world. It's the actually existing world, but another world would be possible, a real world that we can't see. So that's an overall starting point. But of course, it raises the question, if we're thinking about law or criminal justice, how do we get from where we are to somewhere else? And here I think I would say something about the potential of academic study. I think academics are in a strange position. They're a marginal group, and in many ways they're a vulnerable group, a privileged group, but a vulnerable group. But part of their privilege is an ability to think beyond, to think outside what actually exists, and to try and relate what actually exists to what lies beyond. So that then gives rise to two kinds of critique. This is a seminar on critical criminal law, and I think we have to understand critique we have to be clear about how we understand critique. And of course, different kinds of critique are possible, but what I would suggest is that there are two kinds of critique that are important. The first comes from the question, what is it that lies within our existing practices that can be brought out, that might be hidden within our existing practices, but which can be brought out? And that kind of critique is an immanent critique. What lies immanent within the material? But then there's a second kind of critique, which is what moral psychology is about, which is what is this thing that lies immanent? How can we develop the thing that lies immanent? And that's an ontological critique. That's a critique of the way things are. A critique of human, or a development out of human ontology. And then once we've done those two things, once we've developed an immanent critique and out of that an ontological critique, we then can ask, how does what we've developed, the ontological critique, relate to what actually exists? Here's a thought about the way in which things normally work. So there are I think two moves. One is sort of the orthodox position, and the other is a historical critique. So, and I want to move beyond the the standard position, which is the normativist position, but I also want to move a little bit beyond the historicizing position as well. So the normativist position, normativization, is that we look at criminal justice and we have a standard normative account of the relationship between the state and the citizen, how punishment is justified, the nature of responsibility. And this is all set up in normative terms and then applied back to the actually existing world. What ought we to do to organize the actually existing world using existing liberal philosophical materials? The problem with this, for those who know this field, many of you will, is that there's a huge amount of repetition, that things never seem to move forward, that the field evolves and changes, but it changes within quite a fixed sphere, so that people who talk about criminal justice in the liberal mode are really still talking, especially in terms of Kant going back 2 centuries. Although it's varied and changes, there's a clear sort of limitation to the field, and so the same problems keep reappearing. Alongside that normativist account, we have an historical account, and this is the main critical account that's available. And this is just what the historical account does, is to say, well, look, here are all these problems in the normative account. Let's try and find out how we got here. What is the world? What is the world like historically? How has the world developed historically so that we have these problems? And so the answer to the problem of the normativist account is to say, well, let's historicize things and see how things developed historically. Now that first critical account is where a lot of my work was in the first many years, actually, of my thinking about this kind of problem. My book Crime, Reason and History has got history in the title. But what I'm trying to do here is to think about a third account that goes beyond actually existing forms of justice. So it doesn't just look at them historically, but tries to go beyond them, that tries to point to a different future, but that also sees that different future as embedded in how human beings are now. That takes me to moral psychology. And here, first of all, is a quote from the philosopher Bernard Williams, who was, I think you might say, a liberal philosopher, but a renegade within the liberal tradition. And he wrote in the 1990s, he said, "A truthful ethical life is and always has been one that can include our best understanding of our psychological life. And we know that such an understanding is compatible with naturalistic explanation." So he wanted to link the idea of a possible ethical life to the nature of our psychological life. And he wanted to see this in naturalistic terms. So by that he meant, what are human beings really like in their psychology, and how does that relate to our ethics? And he counterposed that to what he called the morality system, or the peculiar what he called a peculiar morality, which he said governed the workings of the state and the workings of philosophy and law. So it's that notion of a naturalistic explanation that I'm interested in. And that takes me to the idea of the human animal. I wrote an article a couple of years back called "Animals Who Think and Love: Law, Identification and the Moral Psychology of Guilt." So the human animal, and this is a metapsychology, a psychoanalytical perspective, the human animal is a being that thinks and loves. But thinking and loving, how do you get from the one to the other? Or how do we move from the animal, in the human animal, to the human, the emotional and mental life? And I'm not saying that I want to split these off. What I want rather is to show how, or see how, the animal and the human, the physiological, the biological, and the emotional and mental are all part of this one being that is the human. Jonathan Lear, who works in this tradition and who has very much influenced me, writes of what he calls the mystery of the flesh made word. And it is a mystery. How do we get from being animal life in a more basic sense to being able to being the animal who thinks and loves? Another way of putting this might be to say that the human is a strange animal. It is an animal. It's a mammal. It's a higher mammal, and a mammal that is capable of metaphysics. So the human animal is the metaphysical mammal. And if we think of ourselves in those terms, I think that's the beginning of enlightenment as to how we might move forward. So what that means is that moral psychology is both rooted in a naturalistic psychology and generates and relates to and generates a morality. So moral psychology is an emergent ground from basic human drives. So we are an animal with basic drives, and moral psychology comes from that. We have we have the possibility of being psychological beings, of having a psyche. And it's also a phenomenology of affective forms. So we have a metaphysics, the possibility of a moral grammar. So here we are, this animal that thinks and loves and has a psyche. And we also know that we have a number of emotional and moral states. And it's those emotional and moral states that actually are what inform our moral psychological being. Just saying a little bit more about this metapsychology, just name checking here. So my work's rooted in Freud and Melanie Klein in the 1970s and 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s work of the psychoanalyst Hans Lerwald, and then in the more modern writers, Jonathan Lear, whom I've mentioned, and the feminist psychoanalyst Jessica Benjamin. And out of this group of thinkers around Freud, I want to identify two different approaches to the psyche: the primitive or the early, and the mature or the evolved. And I'll just say a little bit about these and then come to criminal justice. So the early, the primitive. So in the early or primitive psyche, these things dominate: fear and anger. Melanie Klein talks about a fear and anger of the all bad other. You know, we see ourselves as all good, we see the other as all bad. There's a defensiveness and a fearfulness in early human life, says Klein. This links up, I think, with, in Freud, the sense of the fear of the angry father, and that fear of the angry father that we take in through the family relationship, and which becomes the basis in Freud for the idea of a very critical, a harsh superego, and a desire to persecute others and also to persecute ourselves. And there's a sense of guilt within early persecutory being, within early primitive being, that is central to that early phase of human life. Alongside that, as we develop as human beings, we mature, maturation happens. And what happens with maturation is that the basic libido, love or eros, evolves through ego. We develop egos and we develop as superegos. And in ego and superego formation, we produce the possibility of loving and respecting ourselves and respecting others in the world. This is another development out of Freud, but it's particularly brought out in Lerwald's work and then in Lear's work. And in Klein, there's a desire. Klein talks in, as we move forward, mature, of a desire to repair imagined effects of primitive anger, hate. We develop a reparative dimension in our being. So our mature being is based on love, self-love, love of others. This comes out of social interaction, which is important. We learn these things, we learn to be these creatures. Our basic possibilities as these loving animals, as this mammal capable of love and psychology, this conception of a being, an animal being that is a psychological being, happens because of our genetic possibilities, but also only because of our social relationships, the social relationships in which we exist. So I just want you to hold on to the notion of an early or a primitive psychological mind state and a mature psychological mind state. The one fearful, angry, and suspicious and hateful of the other. The second more generous and respectful of oneself and of others, and achieving a sense of a balanced relationship in the world. Now, the mature supersedes the primitive as time goes by, but it's important to note that the latter remains remains within us. The earlier, or the primitive, is still there within us. It's taken out. It's superseded by mature forms, but we can, in various ways, still access the earlier form. So the latter, the primitive, sits in us as an inflection. So if you think about anger, so it's possible for a mature in a mature psychology for someone to be angry, but I think there's a link back to the earlier anger of the primitive period, the primitive psychology, that sort of becomes translated into a mature anger, but anger has got some nub of the primitive within it. It's possible also to revert in periods of stress or anxiety. We revert to an angry form, and it happens that some of us, many of us perhaps, never fully mature, so that we juxtapose what we learned early on, how we were early on, with what we try to be now. And I think it's important to see that these different ways in which the primitive and the mature jostle within us are relevant not just to individuals, but socially as well. So the idea of anger in a society, anger in an insecure society, is a very helpful, I think, parallel to the idea of anger in a stressed, anxious individual. We can move from the individual to the social, and the social enacts psychological mind states that we observe in individuals too. Yeah, I'll leave that there, and we can maybe talk about that if you would like to. Let me now move on to talking about criminal justice. And here I want to begin by looking at how a mature moral grammar might relate to criminal justice. And I've put criminal justice in inverted commas in the title to this slide, because in a way, the elements of a mature moral grammar are going to take us beyond criminal justice. So there's looking at criminal justice and thinking about, well, what could what we do now as criminal justice look like if we were thinking in the terms of a mature moral psychology in relation to it. And here are some sort of elements of a mature moral grammar. These are things that I discuss in individual chapters in the book that I'm working on. So the starting point would be that there is, when someone is wounded, assaulted, violated by another, there is a sense of violation, right? There's a sense of violation that that is felt in the person who is injured, but also potentially in the person who does the injuring. Both are possible. That's the starting point, that what we refer to as a breach of the criminal law does have within it, for those involved, a particular kind of psychological experience. And it's not the psychological experience. If someone hits me, my experience is not the psychological experience of an infraction of a law. It's the psychological experience of being hit and everything that goes with being hit. My bodily integrity has been violated. And if I do the hitting, then it is possible for a mature a person with a mature psychological mind state, mature psyche, it's possible for that person to realize what they've done and to understand, to grasp, to sense that they have violated another. So what comes out of violation for a mature psyche is a sense of grief and loss at violation. And it can be grief and loss of the victim, or it can be grief and loss of the perpetrator. I haven't mentioned this. I sent out a list of some recent articles, but I've written on the young Hegel, the philosopher Hegel, the young Hegel, and what he has to say about grief and violation at loss. And it's that sort of idea that I'm getting at here. What then comes from the sense of violation is a need, a desire to heal its effects, to heal the effects of violation for the person violated and the violator. And here, a crucial concept is that of atonement. Now, atonement is a term that we use quite a lot in moral language, and we talk about atoning for sins, we talk about atoning for a crime, and we link that we can link that in criminal law, criminal justice talk, we can link that to punishment. But the meaning of atonement is it has a more complex sense than that, and it is the sense in Middle English, atonement was really at-one-ment. So atonement was not about giving something to serving time for a crime or suffering for something that one's done, but it was rather being at one again, being at one with oneself and being at one with others. And so that's part of a mature moral psychology as well. Next, there's the idea of guilt, of feeling bad, and a desire to restore. That links up with Melanie Klein's work. So there is actually the possibility in the psyche of the perpetrator of a feeling of guilt and a desire to make things better, desire to atone. And that desire to atone can be in relation to be at one with oneself, with the other, with the victim, and with the community as a whole. Just running through these. Next on the list would be forgiveness. Forgiveness is generally seen as something that is part of an exchange between a perpetrator and a victim. I say sorry, you say I forgive. But forgiveness is also quite a complex psychological term. Forgiveness is as much, if not more, from the point of view of the victim, about the psychology of giving up a hurt. It's about experiencing grief at a violation, and then at dealing with, at coming to terms with, at working through what has happened in order that one may give up the violation at the end. So forgiveness is a giving up as well as a giving to. It's relational between a victim and a perpetrator, but it's also crucial to the way in which a victim moves forward. Next, I would say reconciliation. Reconciliation as the drive for a return to wholeness. And I think reconciliation is really important because reconciliation is both individual and social. So reconciliation is how I reconcile as a perpetrator with a victim, but it's also how a society in which there is systematic violence reconciles, moves forward and reconciles with what has happened. Then there is denial and its address. So none of this happens easily. There are processes whereby we deny and we have to overcome denial. And of course, many times we fail to overcome denial. But denial is an important moral psychological term in its own right, and how denial occurs and how it is overcome is central to what it means to be a morally mature human being. Alongside denial, there is mourning and resisting melancholy. And so an article I've written recently is about a film about Chile. It's called Nostalgia for the Light. Some of you will have seen it. And it's a film about the Pinochet regime and about women searching for the remains of their loved ones in the desert. And this is a process of mourning, but it's also a process of combating the melancholia that comes from not being able to mourn. If the state says to you, you know, we've taken your loved ones, we've buried them in the desert, we've hidden the bodies, we've hidden the remains, and we're going to ignore your efforts to find them, then you have to struggle to find those remains. Because if you don't, then you have to accept that the state is saying you're worthless. You have to take that sense of worthlessness on yourself. And that is bad for you. That is the nub of melancholia, of living a melancholy life. So mourning becomes a human rights struggle, and one that resists melancholia. And then finally, out of the ideas of reconciliation and the struggle to mourn, the struggle to grieve, the struggle to atone, the struggle against guilt, the fight to overcome guilt, we have the basic end goal of the moral psychology around violation, which is a drive to freedom and emancipation from violation and violative conditions. I think this is really the crucial final point. So the idea is that, you know, when we look at what's happened, when we look at the social context, when we look at what we did or what happened to us, and we look at how what we did and what happened to us is part of a context, a social context that was that provided the conditions, provided the reasons, provided often the ammunition for the things to happen. When we look at this whole thing, we realize that violation came from a setting, and we need to free ourselves not just of the violation that we did, but of the conditions that led to the violation. So a mature moral psychology looks outwards to the broader social context within which the things that happened, the things that we did happened. And that idea of a drive to freedom and emancipation in the world, I think you see coming up in many sort of transitional justice contexts. So I could mention, for example, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa as an example of this. Not that I'm saying, not that there isn't a huge amount to be critical of in terms of the way in which the TRC worked and the limits of what the TRC did, but in terms at least of seeing through that process what needed to be done. And then if it didn't happen thereafter, in terms of the development of social life, social conditions that were better for the people, then at least the TRC had shown how that would be a necessary feature of a future going forward. So it opened up the possibilities, even if those possibilities were not then actualized. But this is also true at the individual level. It's true at the social level, but also true at the individual level. And I've recently looked at prison reform, you know, as a strange setting, you might think. I've looked at prison reform as a place where you can see the drive for freedom and at least individual emancipation. And I've written an article called Restoration, Abolition, and the Loving Prison, which is about a prisoner, a special prison unit in the UK called the Barlinnie Special Unit in Glasgow, and a prisoner called Jimmy Boyle, and a book that he wrote about his experiences there called A Sense of Freedom. And there he writes about how he changed from being a violent gangster to being an artist. And he now lives and works as an artist in the south of France, a successful artist, an acclaimed artist. And he became an artist through his experience of this prison experience, the Barlinnie Special Unit. So he became emancipated in a limited way through experiences of living and loving other prisoners in prison. That article is just coming out in the Howard Journal of Criminal Justice very shortly, if anyone's interested in seeing it. Okay, now let me then go back to existing criminal justice and show how, alongside that vision of that ontological vision of a different justice, might relate what the actually existing criminal justice system is like. And here, the starting point is a historical critique, the political economy of the modern state and criminal justice system, the way the state and criminal justice system deals with social class issues, with race issues, with gender issues, and the ways in which it deals with the structural violence in Western societies by decontextualizing blame. So blame in Western societies, crime is seen not in anything like the terms I've described, but is seen rather as the expression of an isolated voluntary act. There's an abstraction of the individual. The responsible individual is abstracted from his or her context and just blamed as an individual. And then, of course, you have repetition, the repetition of punishment. People go into prisons, come out of prisons, go back into prisons, and so it goes on. The system never really improves, or if it does improve, it improves in a very ad hoc, individual way. Punishment is punitive, and it's generally punishment for its own sake. It's the exchange of pain for pain. And the nature of the prison is the locking up of the prisoner within a painful situation. And nothing much, in the main, nothing much happens. There are exceptions, but in the main, nothing much happens except they serve time and then they come out again. So punishment, crime and punishment become repetitive. And the system as a whole has psychological features that are similar to what I described as primitive. So it directs anger at criminals. It mobilizes fear of the population against criminals. And it establishes criminals not as others like you and me, but as all bad. Criminals are different from the rest of us. They're the bad guys and we're the good guys. And there's a clear distinction between the two. So the prison system is essentially punitive in the main. And any reform that goes on, and reform does go on, but it's essentially a secondary aspect. It's at the margin. Rehabilitation is at the margin of the punitive persecutory system. And the persecutory system acts as a kind of structure in domination, which includes some reform, but not very much. And that then brings me to my final slide, which is about where do I take this? Where do I take these things to? Because we've got a problem of the two worlds, a worldview in which things are as they are, and a worldview in terms of how could the world be very different? And how do we get from the one to the other? I don't have easy answers to that. And what I want to do is I want to just in these final comments address the issue of abolition, but address it through the concept of complexity. I want to say that getting from where we are now to another world is a complicated matter. Whilst I hold on to the idea that a different world is possible. So we're caught between having one eye on the future, the other on the present and the past. We're searching for a qualitatively different future while recognizing what is not possible, but also what is possible in the existing world. And here I come on to cautionary notes. So I want to talk about the complexities of law. So I want to say, the individualist legal model leads to repetitive punishment, reflects a desire to be punitive by removing people from their context, by abstracting individuals, but it also pays attention to the idea of legal freedom, and the idea of legal freedom has its own importance. Legal freedom, being a free person under law, both permits repetitive punishment and expresses a certain quality for a certain respect for individuals. So there's a complexity there. And so my view about abolition is, if you're talking about abolition, you have to think about what the actually existing world gives, as well as what it does not give. Secondly, if we think of legal punishment, well, legal punishment is vindictive, I think. Legal punishment says, we're going to punish you because you hurt someone. We're going to hurt you. So there's a vindictive anger in punishment. And you see that in what people often say about punishment. They say, we want you to be hurt because you hurt me or you hurt them. But what victims often find is that they don't actually feel better when the punishment's been done. But the other side of this anger is an anger that calls upon the state to vindicate itself. And here I'm thinking about, for example, the Me Too movement and the idea that the prosecution of people who have long remained safe from prosecution by their position in power structures, that the law can provide a way in which people can vindicate the harm that's been done to them. So punishment can be vindictive, but criminal justice can also be vindicative. And I might feel anger at what was done to me and look to the state not to punish for the sake of being vindictive, but to vindicate what happened to me. So again, I'm holding on to a sense of the complexity of the criminal justice system. And often the people who are saying abolition is the way forward, they're also the people who support prosecutions in situations like that of pushed by the Me Too movement. Also, third point, I want to stress the possibilities for mature development in an overall persecutory environment, while recognizing the limits. And then the question is, how do we support change in the actually existing world? So if we talk about a restorative process in a prison, if we talk about a restorative process in a prison like the special unit in Glasgow, what do we say about that? Do we say, well, it's a reform process that's happening in a British prison, and therefore the British prison system is punitive overall, so we can't give any support to what's going on in the special unit? I think the answer to that has to be that we have to sort of balance, we have to have a balanced relationship to that possibility. We have to be able to say, well, there are ways in which we would support reform processes in the here and now, at the same time as we recognize the limits of those and recognize that we ought not ourselves to think that that is the only thing that can and should happen. And that brings me to the final point about abolition, which is that you can think of abolitionism in two ways. You can think of abolitionism as outright negation of criminal justice. So we just do away with criminal justice. You know, in the American context, they talk about defunding the police. We can talk in those terms about just scrapping the system, but then you're left sort of thinking, well, what replaces it? How do we deal with the situation after the existing system has been scrapped? And against that, I would oppose an idea from Thomas Matthiessen, who was one of the original Scandinavian abolitionists. And his argument was for what he called unfinished reforms, right? So unfinished reforms are reforms that hit the system in ways that are uncomfortable for it, right? Reforms that push the system to change and which raise issues and conflicts. And when you raise an issue and conflict and you get pushback from the system, then Matthiessen says, you know, you've actually hit a point where you're doing something that's worth doing. And the aim in these is pushing towards abolition, but doing it through attempting changes that are problematic for the system. And so that's another reason why I'm very supportive of what happened in Glasgow at the Barlini Special Unit, because, and this is a tragedy, I think, but the system was actually shut. The Barlini Special Unit was shut down precisely because it was such a challenge. So in the time of the Barlini Special Unit, I think it was really important to be a supporter of it and to try and push it forward, to see where it could lead to. Could other prisons use a similar kind of approach? Could approaches that were used there emerge elsewhere in the society? Could the prison become a kind of a mechanism for seeing how change could happen more broadly in society? We normally think of society as changing the prison, but if the prison is a radical force, then it may be able to change society. Thank you. That's me done.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Professor Allen, for this wonderful and insightful lecture on the topic. If you permit, sir, then this floor is open for discussion, and if there are any questions for you. So, if there is any question, any comment, participants can raise their hand. Okay, Mr. Amardeep, please.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for this very thought-provoking and new ideas that I heard from you today. So, sir, my question and observation is that you said existing criminal justice is ethically primitive, and this is an idea to which I can agree, and I find it to be very logical as well, because we are, as you said, that we are punishing people, treating the criminals as others. All of this is something that I find very relevant. But when we come to your next point, that is, how do we go from here to somewhere else? How do we move from ethically primitive criminal justice to somewhere else, to a developed, criminal justice system? So in that kind of a system, sir, we are proposing to use some different kind of measures in place of today's jails and how we treat our criminals. But in that kind of situation where we are not using jails and these hardcore punishments, in those ideas of forgiveness and guilt, where we find guilt and forgiveness to be very important, how do we cater to hate crimes and these emotionally charged offenses which do not do not fall under these categories of guilt and forgiveness? The victim doesn't want to forgive, and the perpetrator is not feeling guilty about committing that offense. So, and building on this idea, since we are saying that our society and criminal justice, these both are very interconnected and intricate uh, features. These two are very they are building upon each other. So if unless the society will evolve, the criminal justice system will not be able to evolve. So, and the evolution of society is a concept over which we have very little control as such. So do you think this idea of evolving our criminal justice system is largely theoretical due to this issue, that we don't have this kind of control over our society?
I mean, that's a perfect question. Thank you, and I'm really grateful to you for asking it, because it really it gets to the nub of the issue. And you know, I started with my story from this novel about eco disaster, and the terrible nature of the problem of the destruction of rainforests. And you know, we live in a world in which that looks like the right way to go, and yet some people find, when they think about it, when they experience it, that they find that it's entirely the wrong way to go, and they try and think about how they can deal with that situation. And we all have that sense of despair at the ways in which our ecosystems are degrading, and we all have a sense of despair that the things that governments say they're going to do are not really going to do it. So what you're saying is just exactly that point in relation to, let's talk about communal violence, or let's talk about gender relationships, or racism, and the polarization of communities. All those things are true, and it is also true that the criminal justice system is attached to the social system, and we get the criminal justice system that we deserve, in a sense. And that's where the social and historical critique comes in. Nonetheless, it seems to me that it's in times when, and this is part of the sort of the drama, or the problem of being academics who have no power. You know, we don't change anything. It is the society that changes, and we play a very small part in that, unless we're brought in as experts. But if we're brought in as experts, it's probably to help the system move forward in the standard ways. We have no power, but what we do have is the possibility, and I think it's more important at this point than any other, to be saying, well, actually, there are other possibilities there. And to hold on to those, because if we don't hold on to those, then we all get sucked into the existing narratives, and there is no other narrative out there that can be put against it. And of course, societies go through these periods of negativity and conflict and so on, but they also have periods when they come out of them. And you know, you see this happening in really dark situations, where you have genocides, and then you have aftermaths of genocide, and there is and then the ideas start coming out again, and people start saying, well, actually, things could have been different. Power transitions often mean that doesn't get as far as it should, but the need for there to be a different language, a different grammar, moral grammar, is is really important, even if it can't be actualized.
Harshita, ma'am?
Yes, sir. Sir, firstly, thank you for such insights on the moral psychology. So my question is, like, what are the efficient alternatives for the notion of punishment? And if such alternatives should come into play simultaneously with the punishment, or we should gradually done away with the notion of punishment in the criminal justice system?
Okay, thanks, Harshita. That's not a small question. I mean, I think if you want to look at alternatives to punishment that correspond to the kind of ontological critique that I've been identifying, that looks at issues of reconciliation and guilt and forgiveness, if you want to think about what those look like, you can see examples of these things happening in the world. I mean, the world is a dark place, but it's not, it's not entirely without light. So I think whilst I would be in many ways quite critical of notions of restorative justice, and especially the ways in which restorative justice sits within penal systems, I think there is a nub of truth in ideas of restorative justice that is about seeing the ways in which people might work through things that have happened. I mean, it's been said, so for example, in the UK system, through my colleague Amanda Wilson, who's joined us, with people who do restorative justice in the UK prison system, and they will say things like, prison is full of people who are full of guilt, and they're full of guilt that they can do nothing with, right? They just get shut up in their cells at night and they live with it, and they never get through it. So what could be useful in the prison system would be restorative processes, right? More restorative processes, and then you work out from that. So the transitional process would be about saying, let's work out from the possibility of restorative processes towards expanding those. Alternatives would be, if we're in situations where the criminal justice system has broken down, are there community-based processes in which forms of mediation are possible, which allow people to have the kinds of dialogues that are present within mature processes. And let's be careful about community-based processes for the problems that they may have, but let's think about the ways in which such processes do enable restorative elements too.
Shekhar,
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Shekhar.
Thank you. Uh, Thank you for the great sessions, Professor. The thing I wanted to ask, sir, is when we are talking about critical criminal law, first we have to prepare ourselves for the criticism. The idea of critical criminal law and forgiveness, it's very fascinating for young lawyers like us. The thing is, when we try to propagate these ideas, people tend to throw us with the hardened criminal or habitual offenders. Like you said, people go to prisons, they come out, and how to deal with them. The thing is, Mr. Enrico Ferri was talking about absolute incarceration, and that seemed to be very hard. And the thing is, people go to prison without remorse, they come out of it, they become more hard. How to deal with hardened criminals? That is only my question, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, so again, it's a great question. You know, you're saying to me, you know, the world produces criminals of a particular kind, and But there's two sides to it. So one side is the vision of them as hardened criminals, and the other side is the vision that within those hardened criminals, there are human beings like us. So the idea of the hardened criminal, the other, that is a really actually persecutory kind of notion. It's saying these people can't be reformed. These are the people that need to go into prison forever. These are the people who, in the appropriate circumstances, should be executed. You know, that's the line that's being promoted by people who say those things. And what's necessary is a standing back from that and a saying, well, actually, there's another way of looking at these people, and if the society, if the lawyers, the senior lawyers are saying these are just the hardened criminals, then there's a responsibility on them, on the legal system, to stand back from that and to see that that's a very partial and rather primitive way of thinking about our fellow human beings. You know, there is another way of looking at them, and if there's another way of looking at them, then the question is not how do we stop them from committing more crimes in the sense of locking them up or executing them, but how do we get to them in a way that enables them to be other kinds of people, to be socialized people in the way that they also can be.
Thank you, sir.
Alan, thank you very much for bringing to the Indian audience this wonderful view or vision of a larger restructuring of the whole criminal justice system, criminal law system, down to punishment system. But you answered very rightly. I think scholars have attempted, like Brathwaite, reintegrating punishment, reintegrative shaming and all, disintegrative punishment. Hart also spoke about punishment as just, anchoring punishment on justice. But they didn't, you have taken a very overarching, a big view of things. But at the same time, you are realistic in realizing that the academics are a very small player in this whole game of criminal justice. That is a reality. And strategically, what would you think would be the best way? Whether we push the agenda of criticalism in a pieces, in certain strategic points of punishment, point of defining crime, point of where would you think it would be strategically most effective to bring about a quantitative change in the criminal justice, quality of criminal justice, that we are living in a particular historical period? That becomes a big question. And on that, I would like you to make a few comments as the tallest amongst critical criminal law scholars in the world. I'm tracing you right from 1982 when we met first time in the Warwick historical or critical view of labor and how you control the labor population through criminal law. I was very fascinated, and down the line I'm seeing your growth, and latest in 2021 you have contributed, and you are now coming out with this new book on moral psychology of criminal justice, which is a very overarching idea. But strategically, what would you suggest? Where should we hit to make it more effective, most effective?
Well, thanks, Professor Pandey, and it's always great to see you and to renew our conversations. And I'm looking forward to the publication of your own work in a few months' time as well. So I think that there's not a huge question, and there's not a one single answer to it. I think the issue of emancipatory moral psychology comes into view in a variety of different settings. So, you know, what it would mean to be involved in it in different countries, in different locations, different career situations would be different. So, you know, within the if one were in the Indian context, there would be struggles ongoing within the Indian legal system, to which emancipatory ideas based around a humane sense of responsibility would press against existing practices. I recently read an article by Rahul Govind about the death penalty in India, and you know so a critical stance is possible against the death penalty, precisely, I think, in terms of reminding judges that the other is not the other, that the other is us, and we have a responsibility for the other, and not to just kind of shut them off, no matter how awful what they've done may be. But if one was in a situation of the breakdown of the rule of law, as I think happens in some communities now, some majority Black communities in the United States, it would be a different kind of situation there as well. What sort of community forms are there that are developing, and how can they be supported in doing effective dialogical work within themselves? In the UK context, I could talk about, on the one hand, the struggle to the criminal justice case in Bristol, where they threw the statue of the slave trader into the river, and talk about, what would a moral psychological account have to say in favor of the furtherance of emancipatory identity in that setting. In an institutional context in UK, I would also think about, as I said already, what sort of restorative practices are possible, and how could they be developed and pushed in prison settings or outside prison settings. If I was talking internationally about transitional justice contexts, then other things would have to be said again about how things moved forward, and they would be different if we were talking about Colombia now, or if we were talking about South Africa 25 years ago. It would be different in both settings. So yeah, so there's a range. Basically, what I hope there is a fundamental critical perspective, which then has to be channeled into, applied within different settings as a way of moving them forward.
Thank you. I think the emancipatory touchstone is something very similar to what Paulo Freire spoke of a long time back in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ellen. It's a great pleasure.
My pleasure is mine.
Thank you, Professor Allen. Thank you, sir, for sparing out your valuable time and giving valuable insights and this wonderful lecture on the topic.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure joining you this morning.